Welcome to Rembrandt, the self-portraits. And what I want to do, I like to give context, maybe too much context, but I just want to say a little bit about, what self-portraits were, especially before Rembrandt, because as it turns out, they were fairly rare. And let's talk about that. I went all the way back to the Song Dynasty because as I was putting this together, I thought to myself, some of the earliest self-portraits I've seen have been Chinese artists. And in literati paintings, the paintings made by the poet artists of the 1,000 years ago in China, they often included themselves in their landscapes, but they were tiny. And here in this Song Dynasty landscape, you can see a poet scholar with his fishing pole by the edge of the lake. So I'm going to say that the point of any self-portrait was to show involvement in nature because the real subject was landscape and the self-portrait was incidental. And certainly in Europe, it's a little different than that. This picture by Van Eyck is what might be a self-portrait. It's something that art historians like to argue over. They think it's probably the artist himself. It's a small painting, the size of a piece of notebook paper, and it is that beautifully glazed red kerchief folded around the man's head, plus the gentle lines of sight. The kind of the idea that this character might be staring at us, that make art historians think it's probably a self-portrait. Certainly Dürer and Leonardo, some very great artists made self-portraits. And when I look at the self-portrait of Dürer, and you keep this in mind too, when we look at Rembrandt, I see a certain kind of ego here where I really think that Dürer had in mind the idea of presenting himself as a Christ-like figure, very beautiful and very solemn and very composed and straightforward. One thing you certainly know, if you've looked at Renaissance paintings, is that artists loved kind of playing the game of incorporating themselves into larger paintings. So there must be, I haven't counted in a while, a couple of dozen different figures here in the School of Athens, including Plato and Aristotle in the center, all of these portrayed by contemporary figures. And yes, Raphael is there. And if you're wondering, where is Raphael? I have the arrow ready. He is tucked here in the corner. So he definitely didn't insert himself into the main debate, but he got a minor self-portrait worked into the Pope's apartments where he still is. Lavina Tierlink, a Tudor painter in the 16th century, showed herself at work. And I think this is a prelude of things to come. I think a lot of later artists like to show the tools of the trade, their palettes, their brushes. In this case, she has the maul stick to steady her hands. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, John, are you going to get to Rembrandt? I am getting there. But, I wanted to kind of set this up so that when we come to Rembrandt, we start by recognizing that there was something a little different and distinctive going on in the North, in Holland, that probably motivated the early self-portraits of Rembrandt. And it was the genre of a tronie. And I don't know the derivation of the word. I don't know what that came from, but you find them in Dutch and Flemish art just before and during the Baroque era. And it's a kind of a theatrical portrait. And it means that you're giving someone a study of a type, which maybe in France or here you'd call it a genre portrait, but they tended to be experimental and invented. They weren't of a particular person or a real person in most cases, but they were often a way that a painter could maybe experiment or show off their skills. And of course, Rembrandt was starting to show off his skills with lighting, but they involve a lot of different expressions. Some of them are very emotional, but and of course they allowed you to dress up. Here, this tronie has an Oriental style turban. So that probably was one of the instigators of Rembrandt's portraiture. And you also want to keep in mind that in Holland, where was the money? Where were the commissions? Well, there were some religious paintings, but there was terrific money in group portraits. And of course, we know Rembrandt's famous group portrait, The Night Watch. Here's one by Frans Hals. And you can see that the ability to quickly and expressively make a lot of animated faces and bring attention to individual characters, that was a great challenge for Dutch painters. I'm almost at Rembrandt. I'm almost there. The paintings are coming. I also want to say something about Calvinism, because Calvinistic beliefs were permeating Holland in this age. And when I look at these points, when I consider what Calvinism meant and what it talked about, I think you're going to see some of this value system leaking through into Rembrandt. Calvin believed that knowledge of the self came by, and here's the quote, contemplating the face of God. He also believed that a mistaken representation of the truth came from sin, and sin was a turning away from God or not knowing God. Let's go a little bit further. Faith in Christ allows for self-knowledge and an understanding and appreciation of the world. And self-knowledge is so crucial, because what I think I see so often in Rembrandt, it's that turning inward, looking for a kind of self-knowledge, and there's a religiosity and a moral quest involved in that. And Rembrandt was truly the first major artist to make a subject of self-scrutiny and to practice what you and I would call soul-searching through painting. So his tally sheet, by the end of his career, Rembrandt created about 100 self-portraits in varied medium, and there are still debates about authenticity with some of the works, but in the range of 40 paintings, 30-some etchings, a number of small drawings or wash works, ink on paper works. And this is a significant figure. Something like 10% of Rembrandt's known output, artistic output, was in the form of self-portraiture. So the earliest one I could find was recently rediscovered. It just came back in 2008. It was re-identified, and it's at the Getty Museum. It's a very, very small painting on copper. And to take you into it, a resource I want to recommend, Google Arts and Culture has extreme close-ups available of about 4 or 5 Rembrandt self-portraits. So I took a screenshot from that, and you can go in and see this painting on copper and see, some of the wonderful details, like the hint of highlight on the nose. And by the way, noses are highlighted in Rembrandt self-portraits. You can see the unevenness of the teeth. You can see what a spontaneous painting it is in kind of capturing this kicking the head back and laughing. So this begins about a 40-year experiment in self-portraiture. In this painting, I think an art historian would probably call this a trony, even though it's a self-portrait, because it obviously is something the artist made for himself and not for a client. And it's very, very experimental. And I think what's so extraordinary in this is what's happened with the light and shadow. You normally would think if you want to show someone somebody's character, there's that quote, the eyes are the windows to the soul. The eyes are so very important. And Rembrandt shades them, just gives us a little bit of the eyes looking back, turns the head into three-quarter view. And if there is a focal point in the painting, it might be the ear with some curls next to it. But what a fantastic experiment in texture and lighting, and what an unusual way to maybe imply character rather than to show it. Early in his career, this was an important time in Rembrandt's life, because he was just beginning to get some important royal commissions. There was a prince who took an interest in his work, and through that man's influence, the portrait commissions began to happen. As Rembrandt built up his practice, one thing that he did, he liked to buy antiques, and he had a lot of swords, he had armor, he had lace collars. And you can see in this self-portrait from 1629, he has probably an armored collar that he had spent too much money to purchase at an antique store. We're going to find out later in Rembrandt's life that he actually essentially went bankrupt, and his buying of antiques was one of the things that caused his financial troubles. But here he poses himself as if he had, I don't know, was like a young knight or had received some kind of an honor, and looks at us with a certain aloof suspicion with a raised eyebrow, which I call that the Belushi eyebrow, but let's stick with Rembrandt for now. A more quizzical painting from the same year. And you can appreciate Rembrandt's technique here. You can see how he used the end of the brush to create the wild curls at the edge of the hair. Like the picture I showed you a few images ago, it has shaded eyes. It's all done in tones of brown and red. It's a very, very simple palette in Rembrandt. Really just a couple of colors, blacks, whites, reds, and yellows. Very simple, simple tones that are carefully modulated to give us this effect of light. And of course, that kind of gray neutral background, just a hint of warmth. Here's some small studies. And even when he's working quickly, you can appreciate the acuity of Rembrandt, how much he was able to compress about a glance or a gesture. And with this one, you can just take a moment and stare. There's something inherently abstract about the striated shadow implied on the wall behind him and the great fluidity of the hair. But as you focus on the face, there is a little bit of what we saw in Van Eyck, the eyes shutting down just a bit to stare, as if there's someone else in the room or something to be focused on, and a bit of a curl at the edge of the lip. Fantastic agility and acuity in that quick brush study. Here's another one. Rembrandt did some small series where he made an effort to experiment with different kinds of momentary emotions and glances. And you can see in this one, there's a hint of what I think of as surprise. Someone hasn't quite told you what's going to happen, and the surprise shows up in the open mouth. And you can see the one eye getting to the corner, again, looking towards something. So clever, the way you have the feeling of other things going on outside the image itself. What a beauty that is. I know that Picasso at some point did variations on Rembrandt etchings. He really, really admired Rembrandt. Well, in fact, he admired and he stole from Rembrandt, which is what he tended to do. And this one's kind of wild and woolly, literally, both in the texture of the hair and the way the texture continues in a different kind of a rhythm onto the coat or the jacket. Now, what would you say? Puzzled, but maybe just slightly upset as well, a little bit frazzled, not the best night of sleep the night before. But again, with such minimalism, with such simplicity and texture, it's all beautifully implied. And shadow is always important in Rembrandt. What you see and what you don't see are done with the very, very simple alchemy of open paper and dark ink. I love that one. That's the kind of emotion, the kind of expression that I really associate with photography, with a snapshot. And I think one way to look at European art history, if you like generalizations, which I think I do, is you can look at paintings and say, in very, very slow speed, you're seeing the invention of photography. And of course, David Hockney has written about, well, were camera lucidity used? Were there crystals used, or were there any kinds of lenses or anything of that sort? We don't know, I think, with Rembrandt, but it has a camera-like kind of a snapshot capture of an immediate moment. And the immediacy of the medium, etching done with a single needle works in concert with that idea. Look at those wonderful eyes, open wide this time. All right, back to paintings. Here we see Rembrandt, transferring those kinds of interests to oil paintings, working more slowly, working more methodically. And there's an economy in this painting that, to my mind, has to do with maybe the understatement that comes with the oil painting technique. For example, if you look at the collar is done probably with lead white and a little bit of glazing on top. And because I know a lot of you are painters, many of you know what glazing is, but in case glazing is not familiar, glazing is when you take a textured oil paint, you take an impasto and let it dry with the intention of later putting a clear, transparent coat across it. And in this case, Rembrandt has taken maybe some umber and added oil to it And by putting that transparent layer across the lace collar, suddenly you have texture. You get little hills of white with valleys and rivers of this umber, and you get the feeling of lace. You get the feeling of something folded. And glazes are probably also the source of the shading on the cheek, where we alternate the highlight, the dark and the shadow. And all of this has the feeling of underpainting and transparency, trying to get that illusion of light so that you get the radiant light, the highlight that falls on the open cheek. Anyways, that's a little bit musing on the technical side of Rembrandt, and that's, a pleasing thing to do. One more lovely detail. Look at the very, very simple curved strokes under the collar that imply a different type of fabric and the roundness of the neck. Here's an etching that begins a theme that's going to also show up in some of the paintings. Remember in this era that Amsterdam was a trade center, and there was a great kind of colonialist fascination with other areas of the world, especially with Asia, where the Dutch were establishing colonies. So there was a theme that you and I would call, in our terms, Orientalism, but Rembrandt would masquerade or paint himself as an Oriental potentate, almost a little bit like, flirting with a kind of a fantasy of royalty on his own terms. So we have this kind of magnificent hat or fuzzy turban that's on his head here as he looks forward with a certain disdain, prideful disdain. You're going to see that in the paintings as well. So things change for him around 1631. That's when he actually moves from Leiden to Amsterdam. It is a vibrant, expanding trade capital. And this is where the portrait commissions on a large scale begin to be available. And it's where his commercial success goes to the next level. So here's an oval portrait he did in 1632. And you see him doing what really was a necessity for Dutch painters to master. It was the lace collar. And the women's collars tended to be even more elaborate, but of course they were expensive, they were status symbols, and the people that had these collars probably had household help that spent the morning just pressing their lacework, the collars and the cuffs, and wearing one in public was a sign that you had arrived, quite a fashion statement. So here Rembrandt tries one of those collars on himself, and he really has used a sort of shorthand in the edges. It's not that you explicitly get lace, but you get the texture of lace. And using that Rembrandtian technique of a highlighted side of the face, alternated with a dark side, all of it crowned with a very, very simple and interesting shape of a black hat. You put the highlight onto the face and onto the person's character. And I'm going to overlay that with an actual portrait from the same year of 1532. You can see he slowed down for the client. He used the same oval format, but he took the time to really express everything that needed to be said about that wonderful lace collar. It's almost photographic. And when you have the wonderful opportunity to travel and see Rembrandt paintings, there are a couple of museums where you can see earlier and later Rembrandts together. And I'm going to call this one earlier and tell you that when you encounter a painting like this, you will have a feeling that's almost akin to photography. Very, very refined and very, very subtle. But you will look at late Rembrandts, you'll see much more texture, much more visible glazing, and you'll get something that really, identifies very, very early, even 10 feet away, as painted. So Rembrandt went through a series of styles, maybe two, depending on what his clients wanted from him and what they were willing to pay. Going back to a self-portrait, here's 1632. This is not the best photo that I found, but it is interesting to see that a little bit of green has made its way into the background. There's a different kind of lighting, but still that formula of the highlighted face. There's something interesting here, which is the man reaching into, or Rembrandt, reaching toward the jacket. And that's something you may have seen in Titian paintings. There's a couple of very famous Titian paintings of young gentlemen with their hand raised. And so it is a dignified gesture. And this is very much a self-portrait where, again, you get that sideways glance, looking towards something implied outside of the picture. Another Oriental theme in 1634. And looking at this, you can kind of add up Rembrandt's bill at the antique shop because his studio was filling up with props. Looks like he had himself a pretty heavy-duty sword. He now has an ermine collar, which of course I associate that with royalty. There's a feather on the cap. There's a heavy gold chain. And you should probably know that in this era, gold chains were very often given as gifts by nobility or royalty for diplomatic assignments. So I don't know if this is something that Rembrandt was given by a client, or maybe something he bought with himself by himself with profits. But it is I'm going to say Rembrandt at his most hoity-toity for sure, presenting himself as literally kind of guarded and aloof, and that's unusual in Rembrandt portraits, self-portraits. Taking the feather notion even further, you can see that fantastic headgear is reflected on the back wall. And honestly, to appreciate this self-portrait, I would start in the back. I would start with a wall and look at that gradient of kind of amber colored light against a reflective gray wall with a patch in the plaster. And it creates a very, very cinematic, very dynamic, soft shadow on the back wall. I don't think I've seen anything that subtle in other Baroque paintings in terms of a real projected shadow. And then that's just the setting for this tremendous interest in clothing and gear in this painting. I don't know of Rembrandt working with assistants. I'm thinking maybe he had some students' help, but I don't know. But look at the tremendous embroidery. Look at the sense of a velvet texture. Look at the hair as if it had just been washed out. Every feather in the cap, laid out very softly and beautifully. So that is the kind of treatment in a self-portrait that Rembrandt probably gave to his wealthiest clients in the commission portraits who wanted their vanity rewarded. And here in 1635, he is suiting his own vanity for sure. This is a portrait where there's been a debate about, is it Rembrandt as the male figure? So we'll let that debate play itself out. It's probably a self-portrait, but we do know that the model is his wife, Saskia. And as we'll say, Rembrandt or whoever this man is shows off his 40 ounces of beer, you can see she's kind of turning her head to look back and see what's happening behind her, caught in an amber light in the background, probably approving and disapproving at the same time of the revelry in the foreground. And a wonderful detail of a foreshortened sword and handle on the back of the costume, the lifting of skirts, which of course I'd more expect that in the painting of Franz Hals, but the lively good spirits that go with having money in the bank and ale in the tankard. A curtain in the background, a la Titian, adds to the theatricality of the picture. Are you detecting a mood swing in 1636? I think I am. It's almost as if the costumes have been put away in this little sketch. And we see, the man behind all of the theatricality, open collar, a little bit tired, could use a shave, and he looks at us with a new frankness. And this is a kind of predictor of the direction that the self-portraits and that Rembrandt's personal and professional life are going to go. Worked on for maybe 2 years, 1636 to 1638. I think I'd like to keep what I say about this portrait, this self-portrait, very, very brief. So let me put it out there. Masterful. I'll let that sit for a moment. That's a painter at the top of his game. So beautifully and sensitively realized. Everything that I think a collector would want in a Rembrandt. from the gleaming of metal and details to the softness and the insight into character that you see in the features, a subtly modulated background, you know, what only a handful of painters in the history of art have gotten to this level. 1637, a little more pulled back, a little bit more withdrawn. And I again maybe have the feeling that I don't have a great photograph of this particular painting. I know it has gray tones in the background, but the colors feel a little bit grayed down as well. 1639, an oval portrait with a collar, some attention paid to hints of architecture, as if we're looking through, a window, an opening, maybe set in a older building or even a cathedral in the upstairs. So that's a different setting for Rembrandt. An etching of 1639, and there's a new device here. Again, we think it's something he borrowed from Titian, but he is leaning on a kind of a railing. And that allows a different pose where he puts his weight on the railing and creates this kind of visual overhang. It's like the arm or the forearm comes into our space, and then he rests his weight. He rests the portraiture on that. And he here has the hat that I think some of the painters of his era called the Rembrandt hat, the kind of artist's beret. Here's a painted version. And just to give you a kind of a side-by-side, there is the etching we just saw. I think you probably realize that when you make an etching on a plate, it's printed in reverse. So when he worked on the plate, he had that same, he was still showing the same side that he was in the painting, but it just reverses in the printing process. What do I see here? What do you see here? You should be asking yourself, a middle-aged man, maybe some greater maturity, maybe some greater relaxation, but a hint of fatigue as well. I notice in this one, I feel like Rembrandt in the oil painting is really making eye contact with whoever stands directly in front of the painting. And one of the themes I want to give for the late self-portraits is I think that Rembrandt is the first painter in art history that really offers you himself as a human being with some vulnerability. And it's showing up in 1640. And when you consider Rembrandt's life, this maturity, the hard-won emotions that show up in the paintings, it begins to make sense. Rembrandt and his wife were affluent in the early 1640s, but imagine this, having 3 children die within weeks of their births. And I know that that was perhaps more expected in the 17th century, but still, I mean, how devastating. And their one son, Titus, did live into adulthood, followed not long after that by the death of his mother in 1642, probably from tuberculosis. And the little painting that I put up there, it is here in Southern California at the Norton Simon Museum. And when I used to go see it in Pasadena, it was identified as Titus, and now they're calling it Portrait of a Boy. So it may be another situation where the art historians are having their conversations and trying to make out whether that is really Rembrandt's son or not. But if it is, dressed like his father in a feathered hat, a very affectionate painting. So there's a sobriety in the paintings that come next. A lot of the formula is still there, the gleam and the glitter of the necklaces, the texture of the fur, but Rembrandt is admitting and acknowledging a kind of a wistfulness into the paintings. Also a different position of the hand, rather than the Napoleon pose of, the hand going into the jacket, the hand is in front of him, as if he might be able to reach out to you. When I used to teach art history, I would look at pictures like this with my class, and I'd ask them if Rembrandt was someone that you knew, if he was your teacher or your parent or your minister, would you trust Rembrandt with your secrets? I thought that was a really, really great question to ask people to get them to look at the paintings. And this is the point in his work when my students began to say, yes, I would, because you see a person that is beginning to know himself And when someone knows themselves, when they have that wisdom that comes with age and with difficulty, they begin to engender more trust from others. 1645, is it just me, or is Rembrandt for the first time maybe a little bit confused? It's almost as if the portrait begs a question more than a statement. What do you think of me? That may be, reading into it a little bit, but I think reading into them is one of the joys of these paintings. And I hope, again, during the presentation and afterwards on your own, I hope you'll ask questions like I used to in my art history class and have your own conversation with Rembrandt, because here's a man from the 17th century that you can have a conversation with through these self-portraits. 1652, there's a tear in the sleeve, hands on the belt, a much rougher application of paint, which shows the direction that Rembrandt was going technically. And I am going to have some close-ups of these later paintings where you can appreciate the technique, but it's almost as if, we would say conceptually, the roughness of the paint application has to do more with the openness and the vulnerability of the emotions. Hangdog in 1653, this goes back to that earlier painting where the eyes are entirely in shadow. The thing that comes to mind is a raccoon mask, if you will, of shadow across the face. The hair taking the composition across the shoulder. So despite all the success that he'd had, a person needs to keep selling paintings to keep the bank account alive. Rembrandt was increasingly in financial trouble in the 1650s. He had been sued by one mistress and then had another mistress because his wife, Saskia, had passed away. And in 1653, he went through, I think, what you and I would call foreclosure. I believe he had to sell one house and a lot of property. There was a trustee that he had to negotiate with to reconfigure his finances. And then a few years later, he was insolvent. We use the word bankruptcy, but he went through a big series of financial reverses. And a lot of them were his fault. A lot of them did have to do with his own overspending, especially as a collector. 1655, this fantastic self-portrait that is just, to me, so alive, so present in my space. I can show you, let's see. No, I thought I had a close-up of that. I wish I had a close-up of that because the impasto, the roughness of the skin is there. It's a leather-like texture on his skin. And wonderful small details like the breaks in the felt hat or the delicacy of the craquelure, which came afterwards in the life of the painting. The tiny white knotted impasto under his Adam's apple. And the nose. Rembrandt's nose is a little bit blunt and always high-lit. So it's maybe the second focal point after you look into his eyes and feel the moisture under the lids. Incredible. An expression of pride, again, a kind of regality in 1658 as he holds a staff and looks out at you with a highlight on one eye. Look at what's happening with the shadow. The shadow creates almost a straight line across the face. And again, I think there's very few painters that could pull that off. So it's as if he is just looking at you from under the shadow of the painting. And then the rest of his figure emerges forward with this highlight on his chest, with a red sash around all of it, glimmering and gleaming. You feel yourself in a very, very deeply lit space where light must have come from a window. And of course, I know you and I, we automatically begin thinking about artificial lighting, and there wasn't any. There were lanterns or windows that Rembrandt could use in the studio to create, the effects as he wanted to paint them. 1659, now I have a close-up. That is from Google Arts and Culture. And you can just take a minute and stare. You can see the richness of color. There's ochre, there's pink, there's patches of red. tiny white dots of highlight, glazes in the eye socket and around the lid. He really makes you feel the shape of the skull underneath the face. But you feel it's the work of a painter too. I think it's a wonderful experience to be in a museum. Not that I need to tell you, but here I am chatting away on Zoom. It's such a wonderful experience to stand in front of a Rembrandt and think about the man in the studio standing at his easel with the brush, and which brushstroke did he make first, and which did he make next, and what did he cover up as he went. I like the idea when you look at a painting like this one, that one of the subjects of the painting is the artist's struggle and effort and skill in making the painting. So it's a self-portrait where the individual skill of the artist makes it possible. It's a union between those two things. 1659, Rembrandt poignantly has 4 more years to live. He's almost an ordinary man in this painting. You might pass him on the street or sit next to him on the bus bench, right? You know, someone who's, very familiar. Like the tear-link painting I showed you, here he is at work, tools of the trade, oil on the palette. Look at the edge of the panel on the easel, just touching a gleam of light. And then that wonderful white painter's cap. No more feather, no more jewelry. I assume a lot of that had to be sold to pay off the bankruptcy trustee. But now, like something like Chardin would wear, the white painter's cap, at work, still proud of what he could create. In 1660, a little bit pugnacious, a little more fallen in the jowls, a wonderful black hat turned to the side to make all of it come forward. 1661, I believe that this one, I didn't include titles because I think titles are distracting, but I think this is one where he is St. Paul or another saint. So he's making himself as a saint at work, which it's another kind of a tronie, another kind of a role that Baroque painters would sometimes take on. I get the feeling I've interrupted him in this painting. It's like walking in on someone that was having, a deep read with their favorite book. And maybe I shouldn't be there, but maybe I should be. Have to talk to him to find out what his mood really is. And there's a close-up of that painting. They're a little softer than you might expect. Like many Baroque paintings, when you stand back, you're impressed by the credibility of it all. But when you go forward, again, that feeling of the artist at work, of it being a physical object, is so strong. Rembrandt is so tangible in the way he painted. Only 2 of the self-portraits show Rembrandt turning the other way, showing the left side. And this little rough sketch is one of them. I guess it was very, very clear to him that he had a better side that he wanted to highlight, which he shared that with Mussolini. That's not really a good comparison. Fantastic late self-portrait worked on in his later years, 1665 to 69. And there's a lot of speculation about the geometry, about the circles on the wall. And I'll tell you my favorite theory. I love the story about an emissary from the Pope coming to the studio of Giotto in the early Renaissance. And the story goes that the emissary brought many famous painters a piece of, well, they didn't have paper back then, but, a sheet, and said, parchment, I'd like you to make a circle to take this back to the Pope, and it's going to be a sample of your skill. And the story goes that, Giotto made a perfect circle and then got the commission. So I relate that to this picture of Rembrandt with his palette and his brushes. I really think it's a picture of his competency, of his, own faith in his supreme ability and the clarity and the balance of what he could do. So the geometry is there in the background to set the prideful tone of the picture. And then everything he could do as a painter is there to speak for itself as he presents himself. Whatever he's gone through, whatever commissions he's lost, whatever drama and loss he's faced in his life, boy, is he still Rembrandt. 1669, humble, a little bit of a different mood, again, very direct and very present in our space. And then from the year of his death, the same year, 1669, almost a feeling of prayer. The hands folded, looks towards us. I think it's another question being asked by the picture. And the picture, the question would be, what is my fate? What is next? So Rembrandt outlived his final mistress, Hendrika, and he also outlived his son Titus. It would be Titus's daughter who inherited the estate. He died in October of 1669 and was buried in a rented grave. Looking at his portraits, over 40 years, honestly, there's a kind of a fantastic consistency. I mean, when I compare 1629 and 1669, same man, same three-quarter view, really the same colors, the same emphasis in lighting. So it's a very, very honest, kind of like before and after photos, a 40-year span of self-scrutiny and self-presentation on his own terms with his own skill. But what I want to say to wind up the presentation, I want to go back to context and kind of get some thoughts out there for us to discuss and think about outside and after the presentation. I'm so struck that what makes these so great, there's a lot of things that make them great, but I think it's that combination of the skill that was required and the artist's introspection. I think that painting is a form of meditation, and the thoughts he had about himself and his own life as he worked at the easel. I really think that they are embedded in the paintings. They're part of that process. They're reflected in his choices, and that is part of the greatness, is the depth of the introspection. I know that we talk a lot now about narcissism. We seem to have a cultural problem with narcissism. But there's a different thing than just being vain about yourself. There's this aspect of real introspection, which is very different from vanity, that I think Rembrandt practiced and benefited from. So a little bit of later context. I wrote an article about the Hollywood photographer George Hurrell a few years ago, and he used to use the term Rembrandt lighting. Maybe one of the ways that Rembrandt is familiar to us is, as you look at old movie posters, photographers really learned as much from Rembrandt as the painters did. And we see, Rembrandt lighting in this George Hurrell portrait of 1934. So saying that painters were inventing photography in the 17th century doesn't seem all that far-fetched. And when I put up this picture by Warhol, we're all maybe too familiar with Warhol, and I'm just going to say that his idea of mechanizing the portrait stripped away almost everything that Rembrandt stood for, except what Robert Hughes would call the bare chassis, just the image itself. And Warhol was making the argument that in a media age, immediacy is the thing we're going to be dealing with the most. And of course, he was right. We're surrounded by and overwhelmed by immediacy every day in the attention economy. So was a self-portrait a selfie? Well, kind of. I like a good selfie. I mean, it's nice to see friends and nice to see people in their studios. I mean, I take a selfie every now and then. It's like fast food. It's kind of great. But I do worry that in our culture and also in artistic culture, that there are some things that we truly are losing because of immediacy, because of our need to work so quickly, and maybe the going away of the rumination in the studio that skill building involves. And on that thought, I just want to mention that going back to art history, I hope to see a lot of you on September 2nd. We're going to go back to more of a survey format after this focus lecture and talk about Northern Europe again. And I really hope a lot of you will be there. And if not, that also will be on my YouTube.